I give a fuck? Why do I give a fuck? Why do I try so hard? Why do I care so much?
Welcome to Why Do I Give a Fuck? A cross-cultural conversation between myself, Diane Tate,
and Johanna Thompson. In these times of great struggle and possible shift, we ask ourselves,
why do we give a fuck about any of it? How does the lens we see the world through impact what we see?
and what do we do about it?
Well, hi, how are you?
Hi, I'm good. I'm
Good,
good.
good. We were thinking that we would talk a little about climate change because we are on the heels of a very devastating storm, Hurricane Helene, that went across, I don't know how many states, what, Florida, Georgia, Tennessee, South Carolina, North Carolina, so 5 states, and was just devastating beyond what anyone thought it was going to be. First of all, it got super, super strong going over the Gulf because our waters are warmer, and warm water is what builds these storms to their large capacity. So it was a Cat 4 when it hit Tampa, when it came ashore in Florida. And interestingly enough, I don't know if you've seen any footage of what Tampa ended up looking like. I haven't. I've seen nothing but, what happened in the mountains of North Carolina and Tennessee, but I haven't seen anything about Tampa. So I can't really speak to that with any kind of informed information, but I have heard that it was devastated, that Tampa was devastated. And then the storm went across the panhandle, and then it swooped back up and it hit a mountainous area of North Carolina, taking out the cities of Asheville and Boone, as well as other small. I don't know if you're familiar with Western North Carolina, but a lot of the towns are called gaps. It's like Fancy Gap and Deals Gap,
Okay.
and because it's kind of a gap in the mountain range. And so
Oh,
that's how the towns got named, as I understand it. And a lot of those towns are just gone. Chimney Rock,
mm,
North Carolina, is gone. Asheville was horrifically flooded. Animal shelters and things that were decimated. Animals
yeah.
lost in large. And I saw this morning that the number is about 1,000 people that are still unaccounted for. So very, very, very heartbreaking situation. And and that is leads us to talk about, as we reflect on the election that's coming up and the conversation around climate change. There are a couple of things that we could talk about. One of them is the conspiracy theory that's flooding around that the storm was manufactured to create
Mm,
a distraction and to wipe out, because so many of the towns that got wiped out might have been were more rural areas, so they may have leaned more Republican. The conspiracy
mm,
is that the storm was manufactured to wipe out Republicans so that Democrats would win the election. And that's a conspiracy theory that's been out there, which is just bonkers. Uh,
mm.
yeah. So, all right. So I've said a lot. What's coming up for you? You're living in a seriously hurricane prone area. So, talk to me
I
about
am,
what you're hearing.
and I have, right? So being in Miami
Right.
initially, but
Right.
a blessing that most of the hurricane storms have kind of gone over Miami, and Miami has only been, or Miami proper in particular, has only been impacted by outer bands or surges, but not in a way that we've had like named devastation in the same way that we saw on the West Coast or going up north into the north south areas. So yeah, it's something that you had brought up in conversations that we were having about what restoration looks like and how capitalism bleeds into restoration and continues this cycle where we will continue to see climate impacts because of the different companies that are continuing with their production that are causing the erosion of our atmosphere and ecosystems and all of the things that are pushing.
Yeah.
this climate agenda, recognizing also that, you know, the earth goes through its cycles, right? So we go through our cold periods, we go through our hot periods, but knowing that the science is saying that we are impacting our world with the level of production, carbon emissions, and all of the things. Uh, and so, how are we reimagining, to your point, what this looks like to do differently so that we have less climate impact? And what is that going to look like that we need to ask our legislators to be doing, to be in consideration?
Right.
And having that all be a thought process under the auspices of capitalism that also is getting to a place where it's imploding on itself because the gaps in resource are becoming so
Right.
large and unsustainable, where a mass of people are not being able to have their needs met.
Yeah.
And not
Unsustainable.
being able to have their needs met even more when
Yeah.
there is some type of climate disaster. So, to your point of the gap cities and towns, what are the resources that those people have in those towns to support the restoration of their lives? What does migration look like when this type of climate impact happens? Where do people go?
Right.
How do they start over again? And then what does it look like when people migrate into a new community? What does it look like for that community to have open arms and enough resources to support that
Mhm.
level of climate migration that we're seeing?
Yeah, a friend said this morning when we were talking about it, she named it climate refugees, and
Hmm.
that really resonated in my heart, that that's what we're dealing with. And yesterday, another friend of mine within the Here for the Kids or collective that I'm a part of said that, you know, the concept that restore and repair, which is what we often hear people talk about at this point after a big storm, is all capitalism, that it's not going to feed the people that were harmed. It's going to feed the companies whose bottom lines get fed by the houses that need to be rebuilt and the roads that need to get repaired and the bridges that need to be rebuilt. And so it starts with this fossil fuel industrial complex that we seem so addicted to continue to use when we know renewable energies are out there and are, you know, less harmful to our environment. So it starts there. It creates this climate change phenomenon that makes these storms larger and more powerful and more sustainable. I mean, when it hit Florida, typically these storms, as you know, living down there, this once the storm comes inland, it typically dissipates because it's over land now. It's not over warm water anymore. It's beating up against the buildings and the trees and all the things, and it starts to break the storm up. This one did not do that, and it moved, and so we're seeing that happen more and more, where the storms are coming through and they're stronger and they last longer. They go further inland, so inland areas are seeing an impact from these storms that classically never saw a hurricane before, or very rarely. So, you know, we have capitalism and fossil fuels that create the climate change issue. We have companies that are making billions and billions and billions of dollars on these fossil fuels, making these storms stronger. The storms come in and take out the populations and take out the structures and further impact the infrastructure that's already crumbling. And then the companies that come in to do the cleanup and the rebuild make a mint on this, and the cycle just continues. And so when you said it's not sustainable, absolutely. I mean, that is completely unsustainable. And it's unsustainable as long for the people that are impacted by the harm. It's not unsustainable for the companies that are making bank.
Hmm.
You know, they don't mind this progression. And you know, I wonder too, they said that speaking into Asheville and Boone are the two cities that were so, well, the bigger cities that were directly impacted. There were lots of cities that were impacted in the mountains region of North Carolina, but those are the two that are the largest population centers, and they both got totally flooded. And they were saying that part of that was because there was a precursor event. They got a lot of rain, I think within a week before the storm came through, so the ground was already saturated. So that plays into it as well. And then you have crumbling infrastructure, you have bridges that are not shored up, you have dams. There was a dam in Boone and a dam in Asheville that both failed because they got 2 feet of water in 24 hours and the dams weren't, they couldn't handle it.
Prepared for that. Hmm.
And so then, yeah, like you said, what happens with the climate refugees, the people that have to leave those areas? Where do they go? Do they get the access to the resources and the support that they need? Likely no, because whatever area they go to then gets overwhelmed by it not having the infrastructure in place to support those climate refugees coming in. We saw this happen after Katrina when all of those
Hmm.
folks from Louisiana moved into Texas, right, to have some place to be either before the storm and evacuation or after because their homes were decimated. And Texas really struggled with that. They didn't know how to absorb all those folks and be able to find them shelter. So, how this all relates for me to the election is that these are the things that we need to hold our electable candidates, the folks that are running for office, either at the presidential level or state and local. I mean, it's on every level. Do we hold them accountable for not doing the foundational work? What would have happened in Asheville and Boone if their infrastructure was actually organized to support um, and was shored up enough to be able to support a storm like that coming in?
And
Um,
one of the concerns I have is with climate gentrification when that occurs,
yes,
right? Because there is this
big issue.
reality in most urban cities that the safest places happen to be the places. Well, sometimes it really depends, right? Because in New Orleans, we saw something completely different during Katrina, but that also helped us to highlight who is living in what communities and what the impact is on the climate that they're going to have. And then what does the resources and the cleanup look like for the repair and restoration.
Right.
I've been blessed with being in community with humans that'll be like, no, if you're getting a house, get it on the high ridge because look at what climate impact is going to look like. So make sure that you're positioning yourself and you have an escape plan and all of those kind of things. So I am a privileged human to have thought about that in the planning of where I am. And I also had the resources to make the decision of where I want to be.
Right.
But when these climate disasters happen and you have somebody with lower economic status under a capitalistic system and they're moved out of the place and then some repair and restoration comes in, those are typically priced out of
Right.
the people who were displaced being able to move back into their communities. So then you also have like a socioeconomic class of people that are wandering around trying to get themselves in back into some type of stability. And a majority of those times, those people are not welcome in communities. So then you have like a social structure that is also being eroded because you don't have the initial infrastructure that you need to actually make sure that their resources are there to repair after and or take care of people and community after kind of these climate disasters occur.
Yeah, we saw that happen in Katrina, that even as most of us know, when Katrina happened, there wasn't enough there wasn't a way to get they didn't have the resources there, didn't utilize the ones they had to get the residents out that didn't have their own cars, didn't have their own ability to pack up and go. And then so much of the housing area was so decimated. And I watched W. Kamau Bell has a show on, I think it's on CNN, I believe it's on that network, called United Shades of America. And he did a special on what happened to Katrina, specifically talking about what you just said about he interviewed residents, people that lived on the ground in New Orleans and their experience after Katrina. They were, even though their houses withstood the storm, they were demanded to leave. They were evacuated out of the area because they were told it wasn't safe. And so they were bussed out of the area. I don't know exactly, I can't remember where they were taken, whether it was to another state or just another part of Louisiana. And they were not allowed to return. And the state, the developers came through and bulldozed all of their houses and built places that they couldn't afford to then live in because they were told that their houses were unsalvageable, which was bullshit. They weathered the storm, they were there. And so, yeah, that's a very real phenomenon. I've also learned about that, how that happened in Charleston after Hurricane Hugo in 1989. The hardest hit areas were, of course, the areas of folks who had been pushed to the margins of Charleston, and they just chose not to rebuild and repair their area, and then it became gentrified, and so none of those folks came back. And so, yeah, that's a common occurrence.
Yeah,
I don't know if that. What's interesting is
all the
that
time.
Asheville and Boone are demographically are different in terms of the racial makeup of that area. That's kind of rural, western North Carolina mountains, and so it's a very strong Appalachian community, which is predominantly white, but
Mm.
so it's got a different poverty index in terms of the ability for people to be able to weather that storm. Not maybe as much the racial component, but certainly the caste and the poverty level component to whether or not people are going to have access to the resources they need to rebuild.
Yeah,
And
when we're talking about capitalism, race is a component of that because of the hierarchical caste system, but we're really just talking about economies of scale, like
right,
who has what resource
right,
available to them
yeah,
and what supply and demand of the resources look like. And so, yeah, folks that have less resource, like I said, I'm in a privileged position because I knew to be able, and I had the opportunity to be able to choose living in a place in a high ridge that's going to have less impact, and also resources. After something happens, trucks come and clean stuff up, roads are clear, garbage is picked up, things are happening, and yeah, you can see 5 minutes away in a completely different area in a car that you the garbage from one community is being dumped in the other community. You clearly see that. And that doesn't have to do with race as much within the context of if people have access to be able to acquire the resources that they need, and if that's not impacted by their race, then
right.
you're fine. Because you have a lot of more migrant people coming through Florida. So you
Mhm.
don't you don't see it that way. You see it more as if you're a person that has financial sustainability
Right.
and security versus somebody who doesn't.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, that's the way that I see it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's Yeah, so when we think about the upcoming election and we think about looking at the policies of the candidates that are running, I'm looking for an environmental justice platform. I want to
Mm.
know what the candidate is speaking into with regard to, does the candidate even see this disconnect or this capitalistic cycle that is unsustainable for anyone that doesn't live in that upper tier of privilege and access to resources. And I must admit I can't speak, you know, chapter and verse to what the two main candidates are saying. I do know that Jill Stein has got a pretty developed environmental justice portion to her platform, but I feel like the propensity to ignore this issue,
That's what I was gonna say. Yeah.
yeah, is not by accident, and it's just another function of how our systems do not support anyone that doesn't belong to the upper echelon of, in particular, in the United States. So, because that's kind of the framework of which I think we're speaking into. It does impact the whole world, but yeah, so
Yeah,
that's
I
what.
don't see them prioritizing climate
Mm,
change or anything like that at all.
mm,
Um, and that's really the thing that's concerning about that legislatively is because you do see like this larger cascading impact on a demographic. So you're going to have the largest impact on the people that need the most resources, but then the impact is felt across
Hmm.
the entire
Right.
system, no matter where you fall. Because even if the garbage is moved from one place to the next, now it's in the next community, but then
Yeah.
things are connected or traffic occurs because something is built up there or people are not using the resources in their
Right.
area, so they're trying to get them from someplace else. So yeah, it's going to be important, I think, that in this election and with whomever is placed into leadership, it's going to be up to people to make sure that they're elevating the stories of like what this impact is really looking like. Because without having the knowledge of that, without thinking about that, then there's not going to be really any impetus to like have any change or to be reimagining different ways that we can create the foundational uh, support that we need to not have the impact that we have with the climate
Yeah,
resources. And
and
I really don't know what that looks like. I mean, there's people that are putting up platforms and giving us really strong ideas who have the knowledge, but it's difficult, right? And then we also are the ones who are bearing the burden of the restoration, to your point, right? Because if government was responsible to repair and rehouse folks after a climate disaster, that would also it would look different
oh,
as far as
and
resource
and the narrative
allocation.
is we don't have the money, we don't have the money, and it's
Yeah.
like, okay, but you just sent $8.7 billion to Israel to continue, their fuckery over there. So we do have
And you
the
force insurance.
Yeah, our budget reflects our values. We do have the money. We are
Hmm.
choosing not to do what we need to do. And then the other climate disaster that's happened as a result of Hurricane Helene, I don't know if you've heard about this, but the chemical fire in Conyers, Georgia.
Mm,
Did you hear about that?
mm. I did not,
It's
no, but
it's
I'm familiar with fires and California and all of
right.
that
Oh,
happening.
this is
So,
in Georgia. This is in Conyers, Georgia.
hmm,
So it's outside of Atlanta. I mean,
hmm,
everything in
I'm
Georgia is
familiar with
outside of
kindness.
Atlanta. Atlanta's so big, but it's a suburb, an adjoining town. And this chemical plant apparently has caught on fire before, and it makes chlorine and hydrochloric acid,
Mm,
I think. And it caught on fire, and unfortunately, and part of the issue is that the chemicals that it makes are reactive to water. So you have a fire that needs to be put
hmm.
out by water, but you can't put water on the
Use the water.
chemicals that the plant makes because that will, and the plume
It'll.
from the plume from that fire was visible by space.
Mm,
It showed up on the weather
ooh,
radars. You could see it on the weather radar. It was
mm,
so intense. The adjoining the area, the people that live in Conyers were told to lock down, to shelter in place. And now, just 24, 48 hours later, when everything is still going, I don't know. I don't believe the fire is out. The roof collapsed of this thing. Their residents are being told it's fine, you're good. The air isn't giving us any readings that we're not worried about. So y'all just go about your business. And all the streets around the plant are blocked off. You're not allowed to
locked off.
drive around it. But residents are reporting nausea,
Respiratory issues.
respiratory issues, coughing, all the things. And
Yeah.
so, it makes me think of the experts that have been talking about the bombings that have been happening for a year in Gaza and how
Mm,
they're impacting our environment. The amount of, and the phosphorus that, they were using phosphorus bombs for a long time, and just the impact on the environment that has, besides the fact that the humans that it's burning alive and killing in the moment. All of these things are connected. What's happening in Ukraine, and what it's doing to the atmosphere, and what it's changing in terms of climate over there. Environmental justice, should be like at the top of
at
these
the top.
platforms. And because this is existentially, this is it. If we
Hmm.
keep continue to destroy this planet that we're on, it will not support us anymore. And we have
Mhm.
no alternatives that we know of yet that they've shared with us. So yeah, it's just astounding to me. It's not just about, for me in my brain, I used to think of just being about getting rid of fossil fuels and why can't we just use renewable energies, but it's so much deeper than that. And it's one of the things that I've been learning, that's been part of my awakening over the past in hyperspeed over the past year. And then you're coming from living in Florida, which was just a continuous. I don't know why anybody would want to live in Florida anymore, because you're going to have to
Because
evacuate
it's
at least
beautiful.
once, if not more. And I quite honestly,
Mhm.
I know why you moved to Jamaica, but I'm like, what you're going to have to evacuate at least once, if not more, every year. And that's a tough decision to make, to go somewhere where your heart is calling you to go live, and yet you know that this is what you're going to have to contend with. And now you're on an island. At least when you were in Miami, you had 95 to get out, you know?
Yeah,
So
no,
decision
if
to
I
make, I can imagine.
but where are you going where there's not going to be climate impacts at this point, right?
Well, I mean, yeah, but there are parts of the world that don't have to deal with these kinds of like storms and things that happen on a regular basis. Yes, the climate happens everywhere, but
Yeah, but where are who's not worried about climate impact right now?
no,
I really just don't know. This is like a real question. I have no idea where you could be without some type of
right, because sea level
the
rise is
water messing up, the melting in
right, right.
Greenland, the you know what I mean? Like all the stuff that's
Yeah, no,
happening in this moment.
yeah.
You're like, so really what I offer is that you be in the place that makes you the most happy right now, and then you enjoy each of those moments in the presence of that happiness.
Hmm.
Um, and hopefully are able to be strategic about making sure you have the resources or something to be able to support you when there's need.
Yeah.
Um,
No, I hear that. I hear that. I guess I have, after I did live in Florida for a time, and living in North Carolina, growing up in North Carolina, living in Georgia, and the hurricane thing is, it's a trigger for me. And I was just down there when it was happening. So you're
yeah.
right. Climate change is everywhere and is impacting everything. I guess I just would want to be away from the storms.
Yeah. I mean, we want to make sure that we're safe in whatever way, right? Because I don't think that we can get away from the storms or all of these changes, but like, do we have the infrastructure? Do we have the resources that we need to like manage through them? Because they're going to exist. We've had these things exist. But because we have more technology, because we have more resources, and because they are getting bigger, longer, stronger, more impactful than previously,
Mhm.
yeah, we need to have consideration and legislation. And we've seen what happens like during COVID when we all just kind of shift what it is that we're doing and how much resource we are using of our natural resources.
Yeah.
That it only takes a day. It only takes a day, 24 hours for us to sit back, not have the impact that we're having to see regeneration in the way that we need for it to happen.
I mean, I love
Mhm.
I've been hearing stories because my sister lives in Boone, North Carolina. I've been hearing the
Mhm.
stories of the communities coming together to help each
Yeah,
other.
man.
That is always, to me, a beautiful side effect of the horror of these storms. And of course, ideally, if we were imagining what we want our world to be, we would want that community all the time. Um,
Hmm.
we would want that to be available to us, not necessarily just in the wake of a disaster. So I'm going to hold space and try to do my part to build that kind of community that can sustain us and hold everybody accountable that is supposed to be in charge of making this different. So
Yeah, I love it.
Why do I give a fuck? Why do
Thanks for
I
joining
give a
us.
fuck?
Until next time,
Why
as you
do I
move
try so
throughout your
hard?
day,
Why am I
continue to
so
ask yourself,
attached? Why do I give a
Why Do I Give a Fuck is produced in collaboration with Johanna and Diane. Music by Norwegian musician Water. See you next time.